Let's talk about knife crime event. In years previously, we have run all our conferences face-to-face with lots of schools in one room. Obviously, that is incredibly unsafe in the times that we live in. So this year, we have switched to a week of talks in the evening. So far, we've had feminism on Monday, and then yesterday we had anxiety and mental health. But today we have the head of Trafford Crime Reduction coming to speak to us about knife crime and the surrounding elements. So we'll start off with Neil, and then afterwards we have two of our young people from the Youth Cabinet, Adam and Mira, are going to be doing some activities to kind of tie it all together. Trafford Youth Cabinet are a group of young people from Trafford who have taken it upon themselves to take an interest in the community they live in the area they live, and try and use their voice to make the positive changes for young people in the area that they want to see. We are currently meeting weekly over Zoom. It would normally be happening now, but unsurprisingly, we're a little bit busy with this. But next week we'll be back on. So if anyone watching at home is interested, please do feel free to get involved. But without further ado, if you want to introduce yourself, Mira.
So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Mira. I'm 17 years old and I've been at Trafford Youth Cabinet for about six and a half years. And I'm one of two of Trafford's member of Youth Parliament. So Ronan here watching is our other one. And knife crime was actually part of my campaign this year. So it's sort of something we've seen a lot in our local area. And I know that it's affected a lot of people that I go to school with. So it was definitely something that I wanted to sort of introduce within our cabinet and start a conversation around. Adam?
Yeah, hi, I'm Adam. I'm 16. I've been at the Youth Cabinet for about 2 years, I think now. There is quite a personal part of my interest in this topic, mainly because someone at my school, Yusuf Maki, was tragically killed by someone with a knife, and I think I just think we need there's an essential urgent outreach which needs to happen to prevent things like that from happening again.
Lauren, do you want to say a few words and then we'll pass it over to you, Neil?
Hi, I'm Lauren. I work for a charity called Youth Focus Northwest. So it's a youth charity providing youth voice in several different kind of areas. From mental health, knife crime, we do all sorts of different groups, but we also work with local youth councils. So at the moment I'm working with Trafford, just kind of providing some extra support with Tom. And I was actually a member of Trafford Youth Council 5 years ago. Well, for 11 years of my life, 7 years of my life, from 11 to 18, I was a member of Trafford Youth Council and I was an MYP. So it's really nice to come back and kind of work with some of the people like Mira, who was a little year 7 when I was MYP, which was nice. So yeah, that's me.
Neil, if you want to introduce yourself, and then as far as I'm concerned, get started.
Brilliant. My name's Neil Courtney. I'm the Violence Reduction Coordinator for Trafford Council. I've been in that role since January, and I'm the first person to hold that role. So it's a new position that Trafford have started up. My role, I sit within both public health and community safety. I'm not a police officer. I don't work directly for the police. I work very closely with the police. I'm a former police officer, but not now. So I come at this from a slightly different angle. The reason I'm in post is that the Home Office, having identified knife crime as a major priority, implemented something called the Serious Violence Fund, and that within specific to Greater Manchester comes in 3 parts really. The first is surge policing, so that gave Greater Manchester Police the ability to do targeted and sort of outreach work, so yellow jackets, but also direct intervention work. The second part of that was the establishment of what's called the Violence Reduction Unit that you may have seen in the newspapers. That is a unit that provides a multi-agency sort of task force around knife crime. So within the Violence Reduction Unit, you'll have obviously police, but you will also have representatives from public health, from local authorities, education, the voluntary sector, academia, all kinds of different partners working together, because I think we've all realised that this is not entirely a policing problem. This is not an issue that we can arrest our way out of, and it needs multi-agency work doing, specifically with at-risk populations, to be able to make a difference. What we see when we examine young people that have come to notice for knife-related offences is that there are often a common set of circumstances that are shared by them, and those become sort of known as risk factors, and those risk factors we can identify, and if we can identify them, we can do something about them before we actually lead to a situation where a knife is being carried or somebody's being hurt. From my perspective, back in when I was a police officer, the reason I applied for this job, years and years ago, quite some time ago, I went to an incident. We've been to this particular property dozens of times. It was a well-known sort of problem address. But this time I walked through the door and there was somebody who'd been fatally stabbed in the hallway of the house. And the offender was still there. And I remember when I took him in the back of the van and drove him about half an hour to the custody suite, thinking we could have done something to stop this. This didn't have to end this way. We've been here before, you know. Is there a different way that we could have that we could have kind of dealt with this problem rather than a very responsive problem? Now that was 1997, so you know, a long time ago. Since that time, lots of work's been done and lots of changes have been made as far as the approach to this, and the partnership approach is something that both as Trafford Council, but also as, you know, sort of what I work with and GMP and everybody, this is an issue that we all have a part to play in, from youth workers to schools to health to you name it. There's bits in there that everybody can contribute to, rather than, you know, looking at it as I think some people do as an enforcement approach where we search people and we stop them and we deal with it that way. That is a big and significant part of the response to this, but it's not the only part of the response to this. So my role is really to sort of pull together all of these different partners in one place and coordinate activity around it using a public health approach, which is something we'll go on to a little bit later. Can we all see the PowerPoints? Yep, perfect. I'm just going to go to kind of slideshow with that. I'm going to kind of introduce just by starting out by saying, as we go through this presentation, the subject matter, I don't have any pictures of knives. I don't have any pictures of injuries. I don't believe in them when we talk to young people. I think it just creates fear. However, the subject matter at the end of the day is still an emotive subject matter that people have touched on, being something that may well have touched their lives. If anybody is uncomfortable, if anybody feels that they can't deal with, you know, what we're discussing, please just bounce out. I'm not gonna take it personal. We are going to discuss examples. I won't use any real cases at all, unless those cases have already gone through the court system. And I would ask during the questions part, and this comes up from time to time, that we not, if we have questions, that we not use any real life scenarios that might lead to somebody being identified. Either somebody's asking a question being identified, because that could put somebody's safety at risk potentially if they're asking certain types of questions, but also particularly, you know, if you're asking a question about a specific scenario that you might be exposed to, that if we could just keep it as general as possible so that there's no issues. If anybody has any safeguarding concerns or wants to report something to us that you'd like us to take a look at, my contact information is on the screen now. I don't mind how people get hold of me, email, phone, whatever it needs to be. I'd rather know than not know. Obviously, if people are asking questions about specific situations and there is a safeguarding need identified as part of that, as a professional, I have to take appropriate action and make appropriate referrals if needs be, and I'm happy to do that. But the main thing is, if anybody is uncomfortable, say so. The way I've designed this presentation is as if I was presenting to our elected members. You know, I'm talking to a youth cabinet. I'm not talking to a school group. This isn't a don't carry knives presentation. This is more a strategic overview of what violence looks like, because it's not just knife crime, what violence looks like, what kinds of things violence is, the public health approach to violence that we've decided to implement, and really what we're doing about it in Trafford, so that you know, when you're out there as young leaders, you know the kind of things that are going on behind the scenes, because a lot of this work is invisible, and you know what's happening there, and can kind of cheerlead for us, as it were, as far as the stuff that's going on. So first of all, I'm going to talk about what is violence, because violence can mean different things to different people. Now, I've obviously got a panel of people in here. If anybody has any opinions they want to share with me and throw at me, I'm very happy to have kind of an interactive conversation. If I do all the talking, I'm going to run out of voice in about half an hour. So if you've got sort of suggestions, particularly where I've got sections in here where I wanted to talk about things. So when we talk about what is violence, one of the things that we kind of have to look at is it means different things to different people. So anybody that's perhaps on the panel, can somebody give me some examples of what violence might look like from your perspective?
Two people having a fight in a pub.
Two people having a fight in a pub. Quite common. Happens often. Very, very easy to define as violence. Very easy to sort of spot. Noisy, scary. Definitely happens quite frequently. Do we have any other just?
For me, I feel like whenever I hear the word violence, I sort of go physical, like just fights in general.
Physical fights,
yeah.
So we've got fights. One of the most overlooked, not overlooked, but one of the things that whenever I ask this question to people doesn't always come up is the idea of domestic abuse. Now that knife incident that I mentioned earlier, where I went and somebody lost their life, was a domestic related incident. And domestic abuse links into this, but it's not part of knife crime per se, but it's one of the significant drivers behind it. It's one of the things that we see quite frequently with those individuals that we're engaging with, is that there's a history of domestic abuse in this. There's really strong links. Something else that we look at is sort of behaviour that leads up to violence. So you've got threats. Now, often people don't think of threats as being violent conduct themselves. There are some circumstances that I'll come on to in a second where threats might actually, in and of themselves, technically be violent. And there are, in some circumstances, laws against making threats to people. But often that's where it starts. Often it starts with people becoming very desensitized to violent behaviour because they see and hear a lot of threats. So I'm going to kind of go into the World Health Organization, and of course, now that I've gone into full screen, your faces are in the way of me things to get rid of. The intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, which is why I mentioned threats, against oneself. So you can be violent against yourself, against another person, or against a group or community that results in or has a likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So that's the World Health Organization sort of international definition of what violence might look like. And there's a slide in a minute from the World Health Organization that we base a lot of our work around. This is what violent crime might look like, and this is by no means exhaustive. So these are not all the violent crimes, but these are some really common ones that we see. Don't worry about the acts and sections. There's not tests or anything like that. These are some that are, and the reason I asked what is violence before using this slide, when we look at violent crime and we hear about violent crime increasing, sometimes the offences that we see increasing are the ones that are on this screen right now. Section 1 of the Prevention of Crime Act prohibits the possession of an offensive weapon in a public place. So an offensive weapon, put the definition in the middle there, that's any article made or adapted for use to cause injury to the person or intended by the person having it with him for such use. Now that sounds like, kind of straightforward. Anything that might hurt somebody is an offensive weapon. So the key really is that it comes down to the intent of the person at the time. So I'm wandering around the street with a hammer, but I'm doing so because I'm a carpenter, not an offensive weapon. But if I'm wandering around the streets with a hammer, but I'm doing so because I'm looking for somebody and I mean to do them harm with that article, that's an offensive weapon. And that can lead to obviously consequences. You can be arrested for possession of that kind of stuff. Then over on the other side, we've got the knives and bladed articles side of things. So you've got any article in a public place that has a blade or is sharply pointed. So that can be a screwdriver. Screwdrivers are sharply pointed. They can do somebody some quite serious damage. People do get and have been injured with screwdrivers on it, not on a regular basis. And I don't want, as we go through this, for people to think there's loads of this going on. Trafford is one of the safest boroughs to live in Greater Manchester. What we don't want to do is sit there and say, look at us, we're Trafford, we've got leafy suburbs and we're great. We obviously have our share of problems. We are safer than some places to live, but that doesn't mean, obviously, we're still taking action to try and keep it that way and to try and reduce the stuff that we see at the moment. So we've got knives, we've got offensive weapons, then at the bottom, we've got the other stuff that we see, which is school premises. This is where I get really worried when people are taking knives into schools. And I get really worried for a number of reasons. If you're walking down the street and you see somebody that you maybe have a beef with, you get away from them, you're not cooped up in a room with them. And if you've got a weapon, okay, there's the ability to escape. But schools are obviously captive audiences. So I get really worried about knives in schools. And it's a big part of the focus of the work that I'm doing, deals with specifically schools and educational institutions in general. A, to keep them safe from knives. B, to make sure that we're not excluding people from schools. And if we are excluding people from schools, because there are times when that's entirely appropriate to do so, that we're doing so in a way that manages the risk, not just to the school, but to that young person that may have, they may have messed up, they may have made a mistake, they've taken a knife into school, whatever it might be, they may well get excluded, but then it's making sure that we build a sensible plan around that young person so that the risk is managed. And that is where we've perhaps gone wrong in the past, is that building of that plan. Now that we do that, we're able to manage risk, and I'm gonna come on to some plans in a little bit. So those are the four sort of violent knife offensive weapon type offences. These are the offences that actually do people some damage, because a knife is dangerous for a number of reasons, and I'm going to come on to that too. But these are offences where somebody is either harmed or put in fear of being harmed as a result of violence. At top left, we've got what we refer to as common assault. So that's an assault where somebody intentionally or recklessly causes another person to suffer violence or to apprehend violence, to feel like they might be subject to violence. There isn't actually any reason whatsoever why, to meet the definition, that you need to actually be assaulted. So we hear in America, don't we, the term assault and battery. We've all heard that. The assault is the apprehension of the violence. The battery is the physical actually harming somebody. An awful lot of violent crime fits into this category, because if I push somebody, shove them, slap them, hit them, and no injury is caused or very minor injuries are caused, that's the definition that we see used. Your common assault, your basic grabbing hold of somebody, pushing, shoving, punching, kicking, those kind of things. Over to the right, we've got what people refer to as ABH, actual bodily harm. So actual bodily harm is exactly what it says on the tin. That's harm. That's where somebody suffers an injury as a result of the assault. Everything else is essentially the same. It just says assault another, so the assault's over here. But actual bodily harm is caused. Bottom left, bottom right are both similar offences. That's where a wound, that's what people would call GBH. That's where a wound is actually caused. So cuts, bad ones really. I mean, minor cuts, scuffs, that kind of stuff are going to be in your ABH. Broken bones, fractured skulls, cuts, stabbing injuries are going to be either 20 or 18. The two on the bottom right. The only difference really is whether you intended to do grievous bodily harm to some person. So those are your legal bits around assaults. In the middle, this is the one that worries me, is robbery. And the reason it worries me is because the only motivation is to steal something. The others usually have a build-up. There's usually some warning sign around it. It's either a fight in a pub or it's not. This is purely a property-driven crime, is robbery. And somebody's guilty of robbery if they steal, and before they do it, or in order to do it, and at the time of doing it, they use force on a person or seek to put that person in fear of force. So if you think about a robbery, that could be anything from guys with tights over their head running into a bank and pointing sawn-off shotguns at the bank clerk and stealing the money, or what it can be more commonly is what we call personal robbery, where somebody comes up to you in a park, says they've got a knife or produces a knife, and asks that you hand over your phone or your wallet or your electric bike or whatever it might be. Or seems to be there was, for a little while, there was a trend of these man bag things being taken. So those are robberies. The thing that worries me about robbery is the fact that if I get robbed, there's a possibility that in my mind I'm going to think to myself, I'm not having that happen again. And what do? Well, I go to the kitchen drawer at home and I get the kitchen knife out and I pop it in my pocket so that I won't get robbed again. We'll come on to that in a second. There's some work that's been done actually with surveys of youth parliaments around sort of the fear of violence. That's the driver. That's the driver for most of those possession offences that we saw on the last slide, is people that are in fear of other people, then kind of deciding to carry weapons in order to protect themselves. And that's where a lot of the work gets done, is changing that narrative. And that really is where I need your help, is changing that narrative around that belief that you need to carry a knife to be safe. Just over 30% of all knife-related injuries are caused by a knife that was carried into that encounter by the person that gets injured. About 30%. Oddly enough, that is exactly the same percentage when we look at data from across the pond from the States. And I lived over there for a little bit, of people who were shot with a firearm that they took into the encounter themselves. And they took that firearm in there thinking, I've got a gun, I'm safe. And when you think about it, it makes an awful lot of sense, because people who have a weapon on them develop an exaggerated sense of their own safety. So you might, if you're carrying a gun and you live in Philadelphia, you might go into areas, engage in behavior, or behave in a way that you otherwise wouldn't if you weren't armed, and you put yourself at greater risk. And we see some of that with knives. We see people thinking that they're 10 foot tall and bulletproof because they've got mum's kitchen knife. And that really is the bit that I can't change. I can't change that perception on my own. With the money that we get from central government, changing that Oh, I think, did you lose me, or am I still there? My screen went blank.
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
That's very strange indeed. Don't know about that. It might come back in again. That does happen sometimes. The light's on my camera. Hang on.
That's it. Don't worry about it. Looks like you're coming back now. Oh no, it's no video.
We can still see your
ignore it.
PowerPoint though. So
Hello, Neil. Are you talking? We seem to be suffering from technical difficulties, as is commonly a theme of this conference.
This is where I'm meant to join in, isn't it? Do we have Neil's phone number? Oh, his PowerPoint's still moving.
Yes, I'm guessing he's still presentating. It's just not picking up.
we can't hear or see him.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh,
Yeah,
yes,
we can hear you.
Oh, we can hear him.
That's very strange. Don't know what happened there.
That's all right.
So I'll just restart kind of where I left off. And so hang on a minute. Let's just see if I get the video back. I think it's lost me. Oh, right. It's lost me video, but that's fine. So consequences. So what happens when somebody carries a knife, engages in violent behaviour, gets caught? What happens next? And why we should be perhaps more bothered about this than we are. Now, there's a couple of things that happen. Obviously, if the police catch you with a knife, you're going to go to the police station. You're going to get interviewed. They're going to find out what you were doing with the knife in the first place, and then they're going to submit the file. Now, you're under 16 and you've never been in trouble before. Most times, you're going to be looking at the caution or the telling off that people think that they're going to get. That's out the window. That's gone when the knife's involved. The very least you're going to have to do is a program of work with youth justice around the offence that you've committed. So it's really important that people understand this isn't just, it's not a minor crime. There is work that's going to have to be done. There is restorative work that takes place. There's a structured program with consequences for not engaging that takes place if you're found with if you're found with a knife, or if you engage in violent behaviour. But consequences are more than that, aren't they? So being excluded from school is definitely a consequence, and it's a real risk. So I get a phone call off schools when they're looking at excluding a young person for carrying a knife. And I will go to that school and I will build a package of interventions to try and manage the risk around that young person. But at the end of the day, it's up to the school. It's not up to me whether they get excluded. And sometimes I'm in a position to do something about it and to say, right, we're going to do this, and this. Can this young person stay in school? And sometimes the school say, yeah, you know what, you've managed the risk. We're comfortable. It was a one-off. You're doing work with them. We've got them into a program somewhere. Yeah, but being excluded from school, it really does happen, and it happens. And obviously, there are lifelong consequences from that taking place. So definitely something we want to go out of our way to avoid. Then there's the criminal side of it. Regardless of what the sentence might be, when you get convicted of a criminal offence or cautioned for a criminal offence, what typically happens is you end up on a computer system somewhere. Now, a lot of people think, you know, I'm not bothered, I've got a criminal record. Well, my mate's got a criminal record and he's all right, and I know him, he's got a criminal record. The danger with a criminal record is the stuff you don't think about. It's when you get on that flight to Disney World and you get to America, you get off the plane and you walk up to the little kiosk, and the fellow there puts you in the computer, and their computers talk to our computers, and they find out that you've been convicted of a violent crime. You're back on the return flight, coming all the way back again. You can't visit other countries. You may not be able to get certain jobs. Even jobs that you think, oh, you know, I'm not bothered. You know, I talked to one young person a few weeks back that thought they weren't really that concerned about having a criminal record. And I'm, well, you know, I don't want to be a doctor or a lawyer. I just want to work my hands. Well, when you want to work, you know, let's say you want to be an electrician, you're going to have to go as an electrician into businesses, into care homes, into hospitals, and into schools. You're not getting in there if you can't get a DBS. So those consequences last a lot longer than people think they do, and provide much more of a dent in people's lives and the things that they want to do than they maybe otherwise think. So again, as young leaders, what I'd be asking for is when you hear people talk about, you know, criminal record not being that bad, have that conversation, because the key to this is having a conversation. We've been doing a lot of stuff. Anybody follow Great Manchester Police on Facebook or Twitter? So I don't know if you've seen recently, but there's been an awful lot of slightly different work done on social media around knife crime. What we're trying to do is have a conversation, and that's really what's important about this, is to start that dialogue back and forth. I think I know why young people might engage in violence and carry knives. I think I know that, but realistically, I might not, and I might be wrong, and I want to make sure that the work I'm doing is based in reality. So you can help me with that by having that conversation with people. And if you're seeing trends among your peer groups that you're concerned about, as I say, my contact information is in this. Let me know. I want to have that conversation with young people. And as a group that represent young people, you could really help me with that. And that's I'll come on to that in a bit. So we've got consequences, we've covered that. We're going to talk about perceptions. And this came from the UK Youth Parliament survey. Knife crime, one of the top 5 concerns. That's probably a little difficult to see this slide because it's designed for your sort of council chamber that's very large and it's going up on a big screen. I know it's a little challenging over Zoom or Teams. So I'll just kind of go through it. One of the top 5 concerns among young people is knife crime. A lot of young people will say that they know somebody who's carried a knife. We heard at the beginning of this conversation from people whose lives have been touched by this, and obviously have genuine and heartbreaking concerns around knife crime and around violence. So we really want to, and I think it's really important that we engage with young people and hear their voice when it comes to this. As I say, you know, hearing my voice is great, but I'm a 46-year-old ex-copper. I'm not, you know, I'm by no means an expert on what young people are doing and what their fears are. So again, coming back to you as leaders, you're my voice, but you're also my eyes and ears to some extent, as far as trends and what people are concerned about and what people are worried about in the community. 11% of young people said they were worried about knife crime, or worried about crime rather, quite a lot or very much. And 6% So a really small number, but still 6% is a lot when you think that there are over 20,000 young people in Trafford. 6% of them fairly sure that they or their friends carried weapons. 6% of 20,000 is an awful lot of people that are worried about, you know, somebody they know carrying a knife. It's not huge. You know, if you open up the newspapers, one of my big frustrations since I've been doing this job is when you open up a newspaper and it's always the same picture. It's always somebody in a hoodie. There's always a sort of hint of skin color, even though it might not be shown in the picture, and they've always got a big kitchen knife down by their side, and that frightens people every bit as much as what's actually going on in the streets. That's why I'm not going to show pictures, and I won't when I go into schools and talk to schools about more generic don't carry knife type presentations. There's no knives in there. Because again, what good am I going to do going into a school and frightening people so that they then carry weapons themselves? It's all about that message that you don't need one. It's not that dangerous out there. It isn't fair to say, contrary to what you might read in the papers, that all young people, when you reach the age of 12, get issued a hoodie and a knife. You know, it is getting that message out there that, you know, you don't need one and there's no need, you know, not everybody's carrying one. 96% of young people don't carry knives. 96%. So, you know, we've got a cohort to work with, but it's a smaller cohort than people think it is. Carrying a weapon, that group of people that do decide to carry them, we know that there's obviously higher rates of being a victim of violence or aggression in the area where they live. They tend to worry more about crime. There are fewer adults that they can trust. There is a frequency of fear of going to school because of bullying. We know, again, having been robbed, being bullied in school, all drivers of knife crime at the individual level. Poor perceptions of school, general dissatisfaction with life. We're seeing more of the dissatisfaction with life stuff. And if you think about it, we spend an awful lot of time as professionals telling people, you know, you've got to keep your nose clean, you've got to go to school, you've got to get those GCSEs, because if you don't, your life's over. You know, we tell people that all the time. And that's a really important, you know, obviously we want to emphasize how important those qualifications in that school is. But the problem we do see is when that doesn't happen for somebody, there's a danger that they lose hope. Again, you know, where you can help me is talking to people about that and helping people understand, you know, that there are paths for people, whatever their current situation, there are paths to be successful in life that don't involve carrying a knife and going to prison. Really positive, 85% of the population in Greater Manchester report feeling safe in their local area. However, the female population, the younger population, and those who have witnessed crime themselves reported feeling less safe than that. That's the mountain we've got to climb. Is that those people who don't feel safe? Because when you feel safe, you don't carry weapons. It's just as simple as that. Unless you're involved in other criminality, which is a very, very, very small number, when you feel safe, you don't carry weapons. And then 65% of year 10s very or fairly worried about personal safety. So here's some characteristics, and this is interesting, and this isn't to sort of single anybody out. Most perpetrators and victims of knife crime are male, or of violence in general are male. Not all. I have a cohort of young people that we manage jointly with the police. So we've kind of got some that are in there for diversion. We've got some that are in there for enforcement. That cohort has females on it too. It's not all male by any stretch of the imagination. Most violent crimes occur between people in the same age group. There is an increase lately in crimes involving teenage offenders and middle-aged victims, which worries me again. Personal property, where that's stolen in robberies, that's almost all males, late teens. Male victims tend to peak early, but it's a little bit later for women. Women much more likely to experience sexual violence, domestic violence, stalking, harassment than men are. Hate crime in the area, higher than national average. We've got a separate conversation later in the week about LGBTQ plus stuff. Well, that's the group that is seeing a particular rise in being targeted for hate crimes. People of BAME background overrepresented in statutory offender cohorts, but less involvement in preventative offers. And one of the really positive things about Trafford is that we've identified that and we're working on dealing with it. So we've we've got working groups looking at, are we overrepresenting, all sorts of minority groups, not just men, but are we overrepresented particular groups within our exclusions population, but also within the criminal justice system as a whole? And is part of that, and the key may well be, like quite literally in that sentence, less involvement in preventative offers. Are we making sure that where we offer something for prevention and diversion, that it's offered equitably and fairly? I'm confident that we are, but we need to make sure we are, because if we don't scrutinise ourselves, then we have no right to make that claim. So we do look at that quite often, and I'm part of that conversation. Fixed term and permanent exclusions from school spike in year 10. It's almost, it's quite interesting to see that, what happens around exclusion. It's quite a significant rise. Year term, unfortunately, is also one of the most important years within somebody's school life. So that's again where I get really worried. Year 7, year 10, both very, very important. Where people are getting excluded from school in year 10, it's very difficult to undo that damage unless we put some stuff in place really quickly. So that's some of the characteristics. Types and trends, don't want to go too deep into this. Increases for all violence types 2016 to 2019. This is national, this isn't GM. But we are starting to see it plateau off a little bit. I know we've probably all got sick to death of looking at very public health data and graphs throughout the course of the pandemic. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in here. Knife-related crime, robbery and possession doubled in the 3 years up to 2018. Anybody want to give me a couple of suggestions as to why, in particular, possession offences may have increased?
If people are feeling less safe, they're more likely to carry a knife. And I guess the more people that carry knives, it's almost exponential. If all your friends are carrying knives, you're probably more likely to. Yep,
that's part of it for sure. Any other suggestions? There's one really interesting one that everybody always realises after I bring it up, as far as possession offences. If we think about it, we've just put in place a massive amount of surge policing around going out and looking for it, around going out. Who's been on the transport network and just, I can see you, so nod, where they've seen the knife arch out, the dogs, the uniformed cops at the train stations where they've been doing the searches. Anybody seen that? We did it in Alti Interchange not long ago. We do it in parks, we do it all over the place. If we put a knife arch up and we find a knife, that's a possession offence. That knife was still there, but we looked for it, we found it. So now the figures have gone up, haven't they? Because we've looked for it. So when you look for something, sometimes it does create an increase around possession. Hospital admission for assault by bodily force is still more common than assault on a sharp object. And there's still obviously a significant overlap between domestic and other forms of violence. We know that to be the case. So these are the risk factors. This is the stuff that I get really interested in. This is where my sort of passion lies. You've got these two big circles on here. And again, this is the bit that I spend a lot of time on when I talk to councillors, when I talk to different teams within the council. So on the left, you've got risk factors. And that's broken down into three sort of areas as you go. And this is the public health approach that we talk about. Nowhere in there is there a bit that says locking people up and putting them in jail. Nowhere in there is anything about that, because this isn't about locking people up and putting them in jail. We could do that. The police are excellent at doing that. They're excellent at finding and targeting those who habitually carry knives and who are habitually involved in criminal activity. These are the risk factors that we talk about before we get to that point. So what you've got here in the green is risk factors within the community and wider society. So this could be anywhere. This applies to, this is a country. Access to a misuse of alcohol. If you've got a lot of that going on in your community, you'll see more violence. Communities where alcohol consumption is more prevalent will see increases in violence. And it stands to reason, really, doesn't it? If you're drunk, your inhibitions have gone down. If your inhibitions have gone down, you might be involved in violence. Access to a misuse of firearms. It's no secret that, and as I say, I lived in America. I'm married to an American. I know a fair bit about what goes on over there. They have 16,000 gun-related homicides a year. 16,000. that is a ridiculous number, because it's so easy to get hold of firearms. And without getting into a political conversation about whether that's right, whether that's wrong, whether they should or not be able to have them, it's a fact. When you have access to and commonly misused weapons, either legal or illegal, you will see an increase in serious violence. Gangs, obviously, if you've got gangs and illicit drugs being supplied, that brings along with it some violence. But then there's the other stuff. There's income inequality. Now, a lot of people look at Trafford and think, oh, we've got quite an affluent borough here in Trafford, and we've got some of the wealthiest communities in the UK in Trafford, but we also have some of the highest income inequality. So you have areas that are quite deprived, that don't have the resources and the financial resources that you might find in some parts of the borough, and they're sat right up alongside very wealthy areas. That creates a significant risk of violence when you've got income inequality. Poverty in general does. And then the quality of a particular country or community's laws, that's more of a national conversation for national legislators, that one. In close relationships, we know that if there's a low level of attachment between parents and children, we know that if there's parental substance abuse, parental criminality, sibling criminality, peer groups, unemployment in the family, these are all pretty common sense factors. You'd expect these to sort of result in violence. And then overly harsh or overly lax or inconsistent parental disciplinary practices. If you think about that young person that gets screamed at, yelled at, possibly struck for some behaviour on day one, but then that behaviour is laughed at on day two, they're never going to figure out where they stand, and their understanding of sort of right and wrong essentially is going to be challenged, and it's going to give them some potential to have some issues. And then you've got the individual factors. So they're not the familial factors, but the individual ones. So we know low commitment to school, unemployment, family violence, early involvement in drugs, involvement in crime, either in the home, as a sibling, whatever. All of these things, these are the areas that we start to worry about. And if I were to take almost any young person that is on my cohort that is at significant risk, I'd be able to point to more than a few of these risk factors existing in their lives. It's not all kids that come from areas with income inequality. It's not all kids that are in gangs, but there will be often a lot of these kind of things in there. The discipline practices at home, how the parents behave, if there's illicit supply of drugs, if they've been allowed to get away with maybe taking the knife out of the drawer before, all of those things. It's not just an issue that affects kids that don't have financial resources, as we know from what we discussed at the very beginning. It happens to wealthy young people as well. But a lot of these factors are there. On the other side, there's the things that stop it happening. So communities that assist each other, a collective view that violence is not acceptable. Again, these are the bits that you can help with. Community spaces that are designed to increase visibility, promote positive interactions, good parent-youth relationships, children who feel connected to their schools. Most of the young people that I've dealt with, again, that are involved in lifetime serious violence, they've been in lots and lots and lots of schools. There's not just one. It's that constant moving, suspended, excluded, off to another school, suspended, excluded. You see that over and over and over again, excluded from school, put into alternative provision, excluded from that. And those are the ones that we do worry about. Schools, parks, businesses maintained, good household and financial security, housing, safe and stable housing. So I've worked in housing, and we know that somebody that has a roof over their head and they feel that roof over their head is going to be there next week, they're less likely to get involved in violence. Now, that's a worry during a pandemic that's caused some economic problems. That's a huge worry. We could potentially have a wave of evictions, and it's really important that we manage that correctly. So those are all risk factors. Getting into this public health approach, this is what we can do about it. And some of this leads into what we're doing about it in Trafford. So what we're doing to stop the problem there. We can prevent drug and alcohol problems by intervening early. We can strengthen communities. We can build on community assets. We can do things like community cohesion. When the pandemic came along, we set up these community hubs in all different parts of Trafford. That connection between government and the people that it serves. That's really important as far as strengthening communities. Looked after children, those children that are, you know, in foster care and children's homes, things like that. Again, it's that stability. We know that if we can provide that stability, we can give those young people priority. Then we can do something about it. Early intervention, early identification support for neurodisability, and then across, you know, mental health in general. Getting involved in mental health at an early stage, making sure that people get the diagnosis that they need, and the support that they need. We deal with as I say, the mentors that are part of our funding. They deal with young people that have mental health challenges, mental health concerns all the time, and some different to others. But again, it's a core theme that we see running through that cohort of young people that are there. Promote inclusive schools and ensure that exclusion is used as a last resort. Part of reviewing that cohort of young people that's been excluded is that somebody's actually looked through every exclusion and can say, yeah, all right, you know, that one was the last resort. And I'll have that battle with anybody. It's saying in Trafford, we exclude as a last resort. It isn't something we do because we don't want to keep them in school. It is absolutely a last resort. Identifying and supporting children at risk. This is the biggest one. We've got a list, we've got a roadmap essentially over on that last screen that tells us who's at risk. It says who we should worry about. And identifying and supporting them is absolutely massive in doing something about it. So, as I say, I've got a cohort of young people. That cohort is rated into two colours, just like this chart. It's red and green. Red, they essentially belong to the police with support from me. They are enforcement. They are actively and unapologetically involved in criminality. That's a small number. It's the top of the pyramid. The next level down is the green ones. They maybe got some risk factors. They've maybe been flagged up. Maybe we've nearly been excluded from school. Maybe we have been excluded from school. But we're engaging and we're talking and we're having the conversation. Those are the ones that I work with, rather than the police working with. So that's a huge part of it, is being able to intervene before it becomes a problem, doing something about it, and making sure that we monitor the outcomes. So that's your sort of intervention. That's what public health says, or public health approach. That is again an international kind of model in dealing with violence. Now, when we talk about violence reduction, two cities in particular have had really, really great successes with reducing violence. One is in this country, and that's Glasgow. Glasgow has significantly reduced violence by using this model. This model is used in Trafford and in Greater Manchester. It's used in London, it's used in Glasgow, and it's used in 18 police forces throughout England and Wales as far as reducing violence, and more and more every day. Merseyside has a violence reduction unit, for example. Manchester does, London does, Glasgow. There's a lot of them do now. If you'd have said to me back when I was a cop, "Oh, we're going to use a public health model to reduce violence," I'd have looked at you and said, "What? Well, where's locking people up on that public health approach? I don't see it." It's not there for a reason, because it's reduction, not response. So really important that we get involved early and we get involved in the right way. Again, just a little bit, if we think of this pyramid, you know, at the top, it's about reducing the transmission of violence, reducing the risk, changing the norms. And I keep coming back to what you can do to help me. It's changing the norms. It's changing that conversation around violence that says it's all right to carry knives. It is having that sort of, we look at 4 R's. So we look at resilience, we look at risk, we look at responsibility as being sort of the big one. It is that responsibility side of it where we encourage our peer group that if you know somebody's carrying a knife, call me, call the cops, you know, call 101, let a trusted professional know, social worker, teacher, whoever it might be, but let somebody know. It's not about getting them locked up and getting them in trouble. It is about getting them into that wheel of programs that we saw a minute ago that allows me to do something about it. Because if somebody had done that with that person that had that knife stuck out of them that I went to as a young cop back in the 90s, if somebody had done that, if somebody had said, look, there's knives flying around here, somebody needs to do something. You know what? Maybe if we have models like that, then that person would still be walking around. This is why it's so important that we talk to somebody, and that's why every presentation that I do has my phone number at the very beginning of it. So this is what we've done in Trafford. This is the bit that matters to people who live in Trafford. Top of it, we've got me. My job is to manage those interventions and to make sure that we're always taking a multi-agency approach, that it's not just me and the cops sat in a meeting. We've got mentoring. This is the bit that I'm most proud of. So we've got a mentoring program that's administered by Trafford Youth Justice, but it's part of youth engagement services because it's not just justice. And what mentoring does is it actually works around the risk factors, not the knives, not the violence. It actually works around, right, I've got somebody that's been bullied at school and we start to see those risk factors appear. What can we do? Well, that mentor works with them, helps them figure out the answers, helps them figure out how to get through that. And that person works for them for initially for 12 weeks, but realistically for as long as they need. They don't get closed off because they've had their time. It's as long as they need. And those mentors, they're absolutely fantastic. Daniel and Naz. Naz, some of you may know from Gorse Hill, and Naz is, both of them are great. But they put a lot of time into these young people, and they care. And you know what's interesting is some of these young people that we see that are involved with knife crime and violence, what we actually see is it's just having somebody that cares. That's what that's what we're looking at. So that's fantastic. 41 young people referred into the service, of which 38 have been accepted onto the programme. Since engaging with the programme, not one has come back to notice of either the police or the partners for negative behaviours. I pinch myself every time I say that and think I must be lying. 41 young people, 38 in there. The 3 that we said no to, those were individuals that, quite honestly, weren't suitable for the programme in the first place. So it was like, there aren't the risk factors there. You've referred in for, it's been referred into something else. We made sure we got them some other help somewhere else. But this is the partnership stuff. Just going back to my previous slide. Detached youth work is the other part. So youth work is out in parks, dealing directly with young people where we find them. Less of a thing right now during the pandemic because they're not there. The young people are not in parks to the same extent that they used to be. And what we don't want to do is put a youth worker in a park and encourage young people to gather around them. That's always a challenge in a pandemic because then you could be creating a situation where you spread the thing. And then there's commission services. So Gorse Hill is one of my commission providers. They've done great work with the Behind Bars program, the Lines play that goes out into schools. All of these things just help change that narrative again. That Lines program changes the narrative that you need to do what you're pressured into doing. And the mentoring that's been done through Behind Bars. Again, it's about helping somebody figure out the solution to those problems, helping somebody figure out, what am I going to do about school, what am I going to do about, about whatever problem they may face that may be leading them to feel vulnerable, that leads them to carrying a knife. So that's in there as well. That's where we are. Covered mentoring already. So what can you do as young leaders? So I've already talked about changing the narrative. That's the most important part. I don't expect anybody that's on this presentation at the moment to become, Neil's personal informant that's calling me up telling me that young people are carrying knives. I don't expect that for a second. But if you don't tell me and you know somebody is at risk of, doesn't mean that they're at risk of carrying a knife. If they're under threat themselves, make sure that you tell somebody. I don't, if that somebody doesn't seem terribly receptive and that somebody's not getting anywhere, call me. By all means, I don't care if somebody calls me, and says if it's a young person who's not worried about life, call me. I'll make sure it's referred across. Obviously, I've got to let the police know because it's crime. If it's a knife being carried or there's offences, but if you're just worried about somebody, look, it's like, I've had this from professionals mostly, but this suddenly a young person starts talking about knives a lot, starts talking about how they're going to bring a knife into school. tell someone, because if you don't, and they do, you've got to deal with that. And if you get no joy, or you're not really comfortable with the professionals that might be built around you, you can tell Tom, you can tell Gus Hill, you can tell me. It's going to get back to the right people. We all have our safeguarding heads that we kind of put on when we need to. Right, an hour. Said it'd be about an hour, didn't I? Any questions at all? I see that there's some in the Q&A.
Yes, so I might just start at the top of the Q&A questions then. So the first one is, if you were to be in the presence of someone in possession of a knife, what's the safest thing to do?
My favourite question is, and the reason it's my favourite question is, unless you're, we've all seen martial arts films, right? Where Bruce Lee kicks the knife out of the bad guy's hand and it flies through the air, lands in a well. That's something that takes 18 takes to film and doesn't work. So the trick to that, if you are in somebody and they've got a knife, run. That's actually the safest thing to do. The best thing you can do is run away, because you're always gonna, you knew you were gonna run, so the chances are you've got a bit of a head start there. Run. That's for that. So that's the first one. Run. And if you can't run, tell somebody. If you can't run and you can't tell somebody, make a lot of noise. It's almost that run, hide, tell thing, isn't it? Well, run, tell somebody, but get away from them one way or another. Don't try and fight somebody who's got a knife, because it won't end well.
Next question is, how do we report an incident of knife crime?
So, absolutely brilliant question. It depends on the incident. Again, we're back to that. If you think somebody's carrying a knife, again, you can call 101. If somebody is under threat that they're going to get harmed by that knife, or they're going to harm themselves with that knife, then 999 is the way. Before you do anything else, you call 999. If you know that somebody's carrying a knife and you're in the school, then let the school staff know. We'll deal with the risk to that person being excluded or whatever. We'll help with that. We will help to manage that problem. However, the trick with knife crime is to tell someone. Schools will let the police know. And if you don't get any joy anywhere else, call me. And I'll make sure it's passed on to the right partners. I work really, really closely with the cops, and with schools, and with health, and with anybody. You can report this to just about any professional, and it will find its way to the police, and there's a pretty solid chance it will find its way to me.
And then next, do you think the implementation of primary prevention and reduction programs in the VRUs are aimed at a diverse range of those at risk of offending, or just the stereotypical BAME young people and offenders?
Brilliant question. Who asked that? That is an absolutely fan. Is my boss on this webinar?
Is her name Alicia?
No. But that is an absolutely fantastic question, and the answer to that is yes. I do think that they're aimed at a diverse range, and I can. The reason I know that, if I was allowed to, which I'm not, because it would breach GDPR and probably a number of laws, and I'd get sent to prison, is if I pulled up the cohort of young people that are in the preventative programs that we have available to us, your Gorse Hill. Your mentoring that's there, which is the one that I'm proudest of. If you were to actually look at that spreadsheet, if I could put it on the screen, you would see that it's a very diverse group of people, and it's much less vague than some people might think it is. I would say it roughly represents the borough. So the percentages that are in those preventative programs are roughly the same as the percentages of people that live in Trafford. That's the key to it. Are there times when certain areas or certain demographics might be overly represented in a cohort like that? Certainly. And we always want them to be, because we know that inequality and deprivation are risk factors, and that those traditionally affect, different demographics more harshly than others. We've been talking about that in the context of COVID. So we want to make sure that the interventions go where they're needed. But I would say the interventions are diverse. They're set out that way. The VRU spend an awful lot of time looking at statistical data around who's in the programs, why are they in the program, are we getting the right people? My big worry is that we're getting the right kids in the program. And I say kids because they're mostly young people. My big fear is that we ever end up missing the right ones, and we have a bunch of people in the mentoring program that don't need it. We haven't been there. And I know we haven't been there because every single one that comes into that mentoring program, we see the referral and sit on the panel. And trust me, it's really interesting to look at that and not see the stereotype. You see the face of Trafford young people. And I really want to make sure that everybody, because it's preventative, that everybody has a fair shot of that. That's really important to me.
I had a question.
Okay.
Sorry. Sort of more on like the educational side of things. So you were saying before, like there are certainly like more affluent areas in Trafford. And I feel like I've gone to schools again, like in those affluent areas, and I feel like the schools, like when you're talking to teachers, they sort of feel a little bit exempt from talking about knife crime or just in general because of the students that go there. And again, it's very like age tailored. So again, for me, I'm about to finish school in a year, and I haven't had any education on knife crime. And the only reason I know about this is because of my involvement in Trafford Youth Cabinet. Do you think there's a way to solve this, to try to get more schools involved? And like, what's the best way to go about that?
Prior to the pandemic, we hired the two mentors that we hired. Part of their job was to engage with schools directly, go into schools, provide their input. If schools have to do it, particularly in some schools more than others, but if schools have to provide that input themselves, I can't teach history because I'm not a history teacher. I will go into any school that needs an input personally at the moment and do it, whether it's like this, or whether it's in a school. Those mentors likewise. They were hired partly to go into schools and deliver those inputs. Now, there's an awful lot of inputs that have been historically delivered as assemblies. I'm not a fan. I'll be honest with you, I'm not a fan. And it's out there. I know this is open forum, but we don't teach mathematics in an assembly. We teach it in small groups in classrooms. This is important. And the best one I've seen is a chap from Merseyside that goes in, and he goes in at year 7. It's year 7, year 6. He goes in. Going in at year 10 is too late because we saw that year 10 exclusion data earlier on. Too late. They've already been excluded at year 10. So if I'm able to get somebody in there at year 6, year 7 and make a difference, then it stands a chance of making a difference and have that conversation, not just around knife crime, but about violence and exclusion and risk and managing those kind of behaviours that you might see. This program is any school that wants an input gets one, and I'm really, really keen on that. However, I've been in post since January. The mentors have been in post since a little bit after that. So getting them into a school when the pandemic came along and started in March has been a challenge. Next year, that'll be offered to every school in Trafford. If they don't take it off, I'm going to want to know why. Let's just put it that way, in a very nice way. But if we don't think we've got a problem, and there's a number of incidents I can point to that says that affluent schools and affluent areas do. What I will say is my conversations with schools have been really, really receptive, both to having inputs. There's no school that says, good Lord, I certainly don't need that. They've all been like, no, give me all the help you can give me. And that works around exclusions as well. I've not had a school say, nah, don't need your help, we're going to chuck them out, and that's up to us. It's absolutely, schools are our biggest partner in this, and there is not a school in Trafford that I'm uncomfortable with as far as their level of engagement around this. If they can't answer the question themselves, they know to ask. And I speak to the safeguarding leads and the heads quite frequently. They're really on board.
You mentioned earlier on that the role was only started at the beginning of this year.
Yep.
Was there a specific event that caused the role to be created, or was it just reactionarily to the way that the Glasgow's method actually worked in reducing their knife crime?
Again, really good question. So it's a couple of different things. Firstly, it is the funding being available. So finding, particularly in local government, finding salary money is quite challenging sometimes. When the then Home Secretary decided that this was a priority that he felt he could fund, that money then came to what we call community safety partnerships, that are the partnerships between the police and other bodies in the area, and it was funded as a result of that. So the funding was definitely the driver, but the success of Glasgow, that was a test. It started 13 years ago now in Glasgow, and they've absolutely slashed knife crime and violence. Absolutely, just probably not the right metaphor to use, is it? But they've seriously reduced knife crime and violence in Glasgow. The other one's Baltimore, believe it or not. I know I said there was two. Baltimore's had really good results in the state. But the kind of drive to do it, the idea was Glasgow. The money was last year, was 2019 to be able to implement this. Because I would do it for free, but I don't really want to. So.
And then, as far as I'm concerned, there is one more question that I have that has just kind of come up for me while you've been talking. And there's obviously a lot of discussions, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement and things to that ilk, about the idea of defunding the police, but in the terms of their funds being used to pay for more social workers, therapists, and other specialized professionals who could perhaps fulfill some of the roles that the police are asked to, but are perhaps less well trained for. As someone who used to be in the police and is now essentially doing something that the police would probably want to do, but perhaps don't have the funding to do, what do you think of the idea of defunding the police in that context?
So if we look at what's happened to policing within, I'm going to be really careful because that's potentially a political question, and I'm not a political expert at all. Resources for policing have been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed through austerity and for whatever reason over the years. I don't like the term. One of the things that I say to my American friends, where that term originated, and I've got a lot of American friends who say I lived over there, is that when you look at how we do things here, so if a police officer attends an incident and that incident has a young person at it or somebody with mental health needs, the police and that care plan goes that there's a whole unit of people at Stratford Police Station who look at those care plans and who sort of fire them into the respective departments at Town Hall and oversee them. They've got a really strong. I worked in a different police force. It wasn't GMP. It was Humberside, the other end of the M62. And if you were to look at the way GMP do safeguarding now, compared to how Humberside probably did it in the 90s and early 2000s, GMP have got a really, really good safeguarding kind of approach to things. So, suggesting that we maybe take money off of the police and give it to social care, I think is a false kind of. It's not a narrative that I'm entirely comfortable with. Particularly, they both should have appropriate resources in an ideal world. What I would say is that the communication between police, social care, mental health, that's some of my role, is implementing those conversations and having them. But at the same time, it's really, really good. And the fact that tomorrow I'll sit in the CSP meeting, the Safer Trafford Board meeting, and there will be people sat around that table from the local authority, from social care, at a very senior level, the local, the district commander for Trafford chairs that meeting. It's co-chaired by a corporate director from the council. There are senior people from both organisations sat around the table having regular conversations with each other. I'm really, really impressed by how well it's managed on both sides. Those conversations. Is it perfect? Of course it isn't. Could we do more? Of course we could. Could we do things differently? But what we've got in Trafford in particular is people who are willing to have that conversation and willing to be very introspective about you know, are we doing it right? That question's asked all the time. And it really does impress me how well I'll sit in, as I say, in that meeting tomorrow. I go to professionals meetings around specific young people that there's a risk of. There'll be police, social care, mental health, housing, you name it, all sat around that table. That's the key to this. Whether we sort of, you know, however we look at it from the political angle, the key to this is the right people in the right room talking about the right person.
No, fair enough. It is just something that has come up a few times when I speak to young people in regards to the police. So it's just interesting to hear your take on it.
Did I stay far enough away from the politics of it? I hope I did.
I mean, I think you still should have a job by the end of this.
Yeah.
Now, that is all of the current questions from our Q&A. So I'm just wondering if anyone else at home or on the panel has any last questions. All right. Well, in that case, unless something pops up in the next few seconds, I just want to say thank you very much for coming down, Neil. It's been really interesting. And in fact, one of the things that came up as a question wasn't even a question. It was just said, this presentation is amazing, very informative. So clearly people have really enjoyed it as well. Was that person anonymous? Yes, it was. Oh, so I don't know who to send the money to. So, I must tell my mum to stop coming on to things like that. So, no, thank you for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for just the level of engagement and the well thought out, and you know, to both the panel and the wider group kind of watching, the really well thought out and intelligent questions. That to see those and to see those questions being asked, is another one that's popped up actually. To see those questions being asked, that's really positive for me, to see that people are engaged and are thinking this problem through and are buying into what we're doing. So I really appreciate people taking time out of their evening to listen to me prep long, and thank you for inviting me. Well, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for the work you do, and also thank you for funding projects where I work to keep me busy. You're welcome. You're very welcome. Without further ado, you're very welcome to stay on if you fancy, but we'll now be passing over to Adam and Mira, who have a few activities lined up for us. But once again, thank you very much, Neil. Do you mind if I stop for the activities for that? Are you okay if I stop just to kind of see the activities? I'm really interested to see what it is totally fine. You do it, man. Brilliant. But yeah, so if you guys want to crack on, I'll give the floor to you.
Yeah, so we've only got 10 minutes left, so it might be fleeting, but I definitely think the questions and answers with Neil was way more informative than we could ever be. So we've got a couple of you left still. I think we had a few videos as well, but we can always pass on the links if anyone's interested to watch in your own time, share, school, friends, etc. Adam, did you have a few questions?
Yeah, I've got just a very short PowerPoint, just sort of stimulate a bit of discussion and just sort of gauge people's opinions on this. Okay. So yeah,
you can't see anything. There we go.
There's this resource. Yes, sort of. If you can put in the chat any answers you would have to these questions. So just on a scale from 1 to 5, from 1 being agreeing, 5 to be strongly disagreeing, do you think social media makes youth crime seem worse than it actually is?
And while people are doing that, I mean, we might as well just have a conversation. This was something, social media, I think, has had a really big impact on, I think, how we see knife crime, especially. I don't know about you, Adam, but I feel like schools and teachers that I've heard talk about this have sort of seen it as a very negative viewpoint. They've sort of seen it as all like the negatives, like young people going on talking about knife crime and, you know, making, as I've said, too big a deal of it. But in my experience, I've always sort of seen it in a positive way. Like people have always been sharing experiences, or, you know, like trying to like look out for others. I don't know, just got to put it out there.
Interestingly, one of the young people I worked with in the last week just said to me that they weren't that worried about these kids in school, that they have some issues with every once in a while. And then they were just like, but they did have those pictures of them on their Instagram story with all of them with machetes. And I was just like, okay. And it's just like, for me, that's a weird one, because I think it's the whole thing where so much of it might be based around look. But if you are there putting yourself forward in these public places that are kind of social media with, I don't know, weapons, basically, I just think it's a really odd change in youth culture.
I think it sort of depends on the medium, because a lot of social media is just in a lot of ways dominated by, you know, old media, newspapers, TV, and sometimes it depends what's on your feed. But I feel like a lot of people in this country, it would sort of be not dissimilar to the, like in the 80s, where you'd have the evening, in America, where you'd have the evening news broadcasts, which would make a lot of people scared. And that also that links into racism a lot in that issue. And I feel like it depends on what sort of area is actually talking about youth crime, because on Instagram you can sort of, obviously it's a visual medium, so oftentimes it will, I mean, you will see the machetes, they will use the visual examples like Neil was talking about, you know, the person with the kitchen knife in their hand. But in terms of how it inflates it or reflects it, I'm not completely sure, because I think we all just sort of have our own custom social media feeds. So if you're coming at it from a more sort of collectivist angle, then that's what you'll see. And if you're coming at it from a more strict individualist, then that's what you'll see. So I think it's hard to sort of talk about social media as a thing in here.
Alicia has just put in the chat, I would say the stigma on social media regarding the topic of youth crime to be worse than what it is. But I agree with Mira, much of social media is what is people telling their stories. And again, you're right, because like for me, I follow a lot of activists, or that sort of like the community that I'm a sort of part of on Instagram. So we do see like very different sort of, different worlds essentially.
Just maybe one of the better ones in this. So the one at the bottom, I think, would be a good, interesting one to ask. The majority of young people who carry a knife would prefer not to. I think the sense would be given from Neil, given that he said the criminal element in terms of people who carry knives is actually quite small in the grand scheme of things. So that would be... I think that would be fairly true. And also there's a sort of more, so the self-defense, is it ever the right thing to stab someone? Do people think that there's any parallels in particular to the American system with guns? Do you think we, obviously the fear, do you genuinely think there is good means or good reasons to kill, to stab someone?
Heavy question.
Yeah.
I
think
Sorry.
I think in terms of that one, it's the whole thing where if you're at the point when you can stab someone, arguably you're near enough to them that there are other options. And I don't know, obviously I'm not the person who is going to be the one likely to carry a knife, but at the same time, it's just like, I do feel the idea of, it's never the right thing to stab someone. And I think that's a very hard line. And I'm not saying there's times I can think of when it would be the right thing to do, but I also just think if you're at that close proximity, arguably if you are annoyed, there are far less dangerous ways to deal with the situation. It's a difficult one though.
Just as we sort of come to the end here, just to sort of finish it off, I was thinking, yeah, so there were some general discussion questions I had, but just to sort of, I've got 3 quiz questions. So if just to sort of test your knowledge on what's happening in Britain and in Manchester relating to young crime. So if in the chat you would like to put your answer A, B, or C, which one would you think of this? So what percentage of those cautioned or convicted with knife offences would you think are aged 10 to 17?
Tom, thank you for answering.
We've got B there from Ronan.
Ronan, thank you for answering. I'm going to say A.
Okay, so the answer is C. It is 20%. So I think maybe that sort of feeds into the debate about the media narrative on this topic. How much of it is young people? Then that, yeah, there are multitudes to this, and it's not just our generation. Yeah. So the next one, how much more or less likely are to be stabbed with or without a knife? So you're 3 times more likely to be stabbed with a knife, 2 times less likely to be stabbed with a knife, or 2 times more likely to be stabbed with a knife.
I'm going to say C. And other answers we have C from Lauren, A from Armis, A from Chaveria.
So the answer is A. Yeah, you're 3 times more likely. So yeah, it's not just, yeah, it's exponentially more dangerous. So yeah. Yeah, so since the start of lockdown, this is a sort of a feel-good story in a way. How many knives in Greater Manchester have been collected in the 12 knife amnesty bins across Greater Manchester?
I'm going to say B.
Oh, people.
B across the board.
B, everyone seems to say B.
Yeah. The answer is A.
Oh,
That is quite positive.
Yeah, that's well, not a silver lining of the pandemic, but a silver lining in it. Oh.
Just to butt in on that, does everybody know where the amnesty bins are?
No.
So for Trafford, the nearest one is going to be in the front counter of Stratford Police Station. And once it's put in there, there's no getting it out unless you have the key. It's a cast iron box.
Well,
yeah, that's it. That's it for the quiz.
So thank you for everybody that joined us today. We also have 2 more events running this week. We have our Environment Zoom webinar tomorrow. So if you haven't signed up, please do and share with your friends, everyone at school, family. And we have the Proud Trust coming in on Friday to talk about just everything LGBTQ+. And then I think correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but we're doing some BSL, maybe, I think.
Yes, so we have someone coming in because something was brought to my attention recently about the fact that there is just not generally enough education around basic sign language. And so this probably would have been part of the general conference in a kind of large group thing, but as it is, instead we just have Debbie, who I know through work, who will be coming in and doing a short basics kind of sign language thing. And then also in the packs, which we send out to schools, there's also some sheets including basic signing instructions as well. But to just reiterate what Mira said, I thank all of you for coming. Thank you once again, Neil, very much.